Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, name is Detainees. IDSF is a leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing so we can bring you behind the headlines, what is really happening on the ground in Israel. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be joined today by IDSF member, Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch. Maurice, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Moshe. Thanks for having me again.
You are an expert on many issues of this war, and certainly that which revolves around the legal components in the military. We have a lot of things to discuss, but let's just jump in, and I want to hear your take, your update on how you feel this war is going, what our viewers need to know right now today.
So I think what's important to know just for now on the war on the ground is what's going on in Gaza. Just very quickly, in Sajaiya, northern Gaza, where IDF forces destroyed a tunnel that was 6 kilometers long. That's almost the entire breadth of the Gaza Strip. And in the fighting, they killed over 150 terrorists, operating again in Gaza City, where the terrorists have again fallen back on their friends in UNRWA, and the IDF forces have again been forced to go into UNRWA's headquarters, which has really become again a terrorist base. It's lost all type of really identification as a UN site, unless the UN is actively involved in terrorism against Israel, which some might argue is true. But at the moment, they're trying to deny that. And then also in Rafah, where IDF soldiers have been continuing on the fight there, really hand-to-hand fighting in order to make headway there into Rafah, clear out those last remaining battalions of Hamas, try and find as many of the hostages as possible. Let's not forget that we're over 9 months into this war, 120 hostages remain in Gaza, and that's something that everybody is fighting to do. Just 2 seconds, Moshe, on events that just happened in the north, the targeted killing of Yasser Nimir Kbarnash, who was one of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah's ex-personal assistants. He was involved in all types of terror activities, arming Hezbollah. He just really just moments before we came online, it was reported that he had been targeted and killed in Lebanon on the Damascus highway and into Beirut. So those events happening there, the IDF also just releasing a report that they had shot down a suspicious flying object coming from the east. That, when translated into normal people's language, is that the Houthis from Yemen, another one of the Iranian-backed proxies, are again shooting missiles and or launching UAVs at Israel, and Israel having to respond to that. Reports of the Iranians moving their maritime fleet all around that area as well have also been surfacing, and so that's also something that needs to be watched along the way. And so that's where we are really on the fighting on the ground. The kinetic fighting is something which Israel does really know how to do well. It's something that we're able to identify a target and attack consistently, which is what really we need to do. What we find more difficult, and I think we should really discuss today, is fighting that propaganda war. How do we deal with the different claims that are being made against Israel, and how do we respond to them, and how do we deal with the situation, which is really the old proverb that a lie travels half the way around the world before it's before someone can put their boots on, before the truth can put its boots on. So how do you deal with that? And focus now on an article that was just released just a few days ago in The Lancet. The Lancet is a well-respected medical journal. It's refused articles that have been written by Israeli professors analyzing the death toll in Gaza, but had really the gall to publish an article penned by a known Israel hater who wrote that the death toll in Gaza, now let's put this into context, the UN, Hamas, claims that there's about 37,000, 39,000 people who have been killed in Gaza. Sometimes, and I kid you not on this, there was one week where the UN reported, Hamas UN reported, that the number of people killed was 468 people. Of them, 500 were women and 1,500 were children. Again, of the 468 total killed, 500 were women and 1,500 were children. So we know that those numbers aren't true. And along comes this article in the Lancet, which has now been really bullhorned by every Jew hater possible, led obviously by Francesca Albanese, the UN Human Rights Council special rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. In this article, the author claims that there are probably 186,000 people who have been killed in Gaza, some 12% of the entire population. The claim is based on poor speculation added with fundamental methodological flaws. And it comes up like this. Well, Hamas has claimed that there's 37,000 people have been killed. In most cases like this, the numbers go up between 10 and 15 times after the war is finished. So if we now roll everything back and times those numbers conservatively only by 5%, we get to this 186,000. So you're really talking about the false numbers of Hamas, really bullhorned by the UN, then used manipulatively to create this illusion of a mass killing, and then being that lie being spread around the world. That's something which is really very, very difficult to deal with, because the truth is so far from the lie being spread that even if you have very limited ability to bring down the numbers, you bring them down by 50%, so you're still talking about 90,000 dead according to these articles. And so this is really the damage, and people who don't realize the flaws in these numbers are really going to be spreading this around, reading it, increasing the hatred against Israel for the genocide that Israel is carrying out in the Gaza Strip. And that's something which is really almost impossible to deal with.
Maurice, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's an incredible number, 186,000. And I'm wondering, to what extent is it even productive to start a debate on that number? Because the second you repeat that number and then try to bring it down, as you said, how far can you go? As much as trying to direct the narrative in a different direction, perhaps speak about the humanity that the IDF operates with. So in that sense, let's talk about the Shifa Hospital director, because that's a case where Israel did something potentially not in its best security interests, and maybe that's a story that can be promoted. Are you able to just give a little bit of background about what happened over there and the legal military perspective?
So let's just give everyone a background into what happened at the Shifa Hospital. Just a reminder. The Shifa Hospital was turned by Hamas into a military base. It served to a certain extent as a first-line headquarters of Hamas. It's the place to which the Hamas terrorists brought many of the hostages kidnapped on and taken on October 7. That was one of their first stops into the hospital, and then down into the tunnels underneath the hospital, and from there being taken in to the Hamas clutches. The fighting around Shifa Hospital was very intense, and really the IDF surrounded it entirely, and then went in methodically and surgically into the different units of Shifa, really bringing in also a tremendous amount of medical aid into the hospital to make sure that as necessary and as far as possible it could continue functioning. And there within the hospital, hundreds of terrorists were both killed and hundreds were taken and brought back into Israel and held under arrest. Of those, it included Samia, the head of the Shifa Hospital. This is the guy who, whilst he's a doctor, allowed Hamas to turn his hospital into a military base, permitted hostages to be brought into the into the premises of the hospital, and then allowed the terrorists to use the hospital as a base from which to fight against IDF soldiers. He was arrested and brought to Israel with the others. Now, I just wrote actually quite an extensive article on the subject of how Israel is dealing with the people who were arrested on the 7th of October itself, those terrorists who were caught carrying out the massacre and shortly thereafter, and with the terrorists who have been arrested since. You can find the article on the website of the JCPA. It's entitled "Detention of the October 7 massacre," and there I discuss the different legal avenues that have been employed to hold these terrorists. Now, some of them are under direct interrogation that we know, criminal investigation. Eventually, there will be an indictment put in against those terrorists. Others are being held as unlawful combatants. Now, what is an unlawful combatant? I argue that international law really distinguishes between two groups of people. There are civilians on the one hand who are protected, and soldiers on the other. What do you do then with those people in the middle who are civilians who take up arms, civilians who act really as terrorists? They enjoy almost no protections under customary international law. There are some provisions in the additional protocols from 1977 that may apply, but they're really not applicable to the Hamas terrorists in any way, shape, or form. And so they are called unlawful combatants. This is a law that was passed in Israel in 2001 and allows for these terrorists to be held almost like prisoners of war on the one hand, that you hold them until the end of hostilities, but not enjoying the privileges of being a soldier who really does enjoy the prisoner of war status. So one of those people was the head of the Shifa Hospital for the terrorists. And so the problem was that Israel, since the 7th of October, has arrested almost 7,000 people. And so where do you put all these people? Our prison service was already overloaded on the 6th of October when we started the war. And now suddenly we have this massive influx of more terrorists that need to be held, some of them in Judea and Samaria, some of them from Gaza, some of them, as I said, arrested in Israel on the 7th of October. So what do you then do with them? Where do you put them? So the security forces in general, the army and the Ministry of National Security have been working really day and night to set up more detention facilities. But that is really a never-ending mission, because we had too many prisoners to start with. We brought in a lot more, and we continue arresting more and more and more. And so at some stage, we got to the point where we had to release some of the terrorists. And so the process that is then put into action is to try and identify who are the people who pose the least amount of physical damage and physical danger to Israel. And so that process needed to be implemented relatively quickly. And within that process, I would argue that the ISA, Israel Security Agency, the Shabak, really made a fundamental and terrible mistake. Whilst I understand that some terrorists might potentially have had to be released, I think it was a disastrous mistake to release the head of the Shifa Hospital, even if he personally was not necessarily one of those terrorists who was about to pick up a weapon and shoot. He, as a symbol of someone who turned a humanitarian facility, a hospital, into a terrorist base to which the terrorists felt so comfortable that they could even bring hostages taken on the 7th of October. He's one of those people who should have remained in custody and detention until the end of the war, and possibly thereafter, standing trial possibly for the crimes that he committed, including holding of hostages in the hospital. And so that, I think, really was a tremendous mistake.
Now, just to clarify, of the 7,000 prisoners taken, terrorists taken, you said some of them had to be released. Can you just clarify, had to for legal reasons or for space reasons within Israel?
No, had to for space reasons. So far, I haven't seen any type of real challenge of the legality of their arrest. Um, those that have been arrested in Judea and Samaria, that's the regular process of the law in Judea and Samaria. Within Gaza, it's clearly the laws of war, and those arrested on the 7th of October in Israel, arrested according to Israeli civilian law. They invaded our country, they carried out rapes, massacres, murders, and therefore they are under arrest legitimately under Israeli civilian law. So I don't think there's any real challenge going on there, even though it appears that it's taking a very long time to get to that point of submitting an indictment. But that really is a function of the massive amount of evidence that was found both on the 7th of October and since, thousands on really thousands, tens of thousands of hours of video footage taken by the terrorists themselves on October 7. Just to go through, if you remember, the IDF uncovered, exposed the Hamas server network under the headquarters of UNRWA in Gaza City. That obviously is a wealth of evidence that has to be understood and really worked through. So this unfortunately does take not a small amount of time, but there are constant teams and substantially large teams working on that all the time in order to get to this final goal of putting in indictments against those October 7 terrorists and really trying to find the right mechanism in which to prosecute them.
Now, in your best assessment, should the Israel prison system be investing in more infrastructure to allow more prisoners taken? Or it's a good system right now, there's a max of how many people can be held in Israel, and there's no strategic benefit to just increase the amount of terrorists caught?
Well, so there are a few different things here. Firstly, terrorists should really, when they are seen and come into contact with IDF forces in the Gaza Strip, the first option should always be to kill them. Kill the terrorists. That's something which should be an overriding requirement. Obviously, when they give up, when they surrender, you can't then kill them, and you have to take them into detention. And so Israel's prison service, Israel's security services must find the solution for how we hold these people. In 2002, I was the assistant to the legal advisor for Judea and Samaria, dealing with criminal and terrorist affairs. And it just happened to be on the 29th of March of 2002, if you remember, 2 days after the Park Hotel massacre, Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield. We arrested also then, within a few weeks, 7,000 people. We built prisons from scratch, really, whilst we were fighting at the same time. And that's something which has been done quite successfully. And that's something that needs to be continued on. We have that requirement if we wish to see these terrorists the terrorists who aren't killed being neutralized and taken off the battlefield. If we keep on releasing them, obviously they're going back to fight. They're not going back to promote peace.
And now I know you've written about the punishments for terrorists, and I shared in the chat here that article you've been referencing, and everyone is, of course, encouraged to read it. If a person is a terrorist living in Gaza, living in Judea and Samaria, and they're caught by Israel, thrown in jail, they're enjoying 3 meals a day, and their families potentially are getting supported by the PA. What reform needs to happen for the punishment, certainly of those involved in October 7th, and is any of that happening right now?
Well, so the general prosecution of Judeans of the terrorists from the October 7 massacre is something that's being discussed intensively. How exactly to deal with them, how exactly to prosecute them, whether to prosecute them before civilian courts or military courts, to set up a new court system. That's something which, in and of itself, is a very wide question. I think that there are really subjects that need to be discussed. For example, the subject of the death sentence, whether it should be implemented. What I argue in the article that I wrote is that Israel suffers from two restrictions on that front. Firstly, we suffer as a country from national trauma. We've only had two instances in which the death penalty has been implemented in Israel, Adolf Eichmann being one of them. The second one, very much less known, Meir Tubiansky, was an officer in the Haganah forces in 1948. He was accused of espionage, tried in a court martial, convicted and sentenced to death. He was later exonerated, and so that national trauma of what do you do with a person who's been found innocent but can no longer enjoy that finding because he's been put to death, is something which has really accompanied us all the way along. So that's the national trauma. The other limitation has always been, whilst it's commonly thought that the religious parties are the ones pushing for the death sentence and so on, traditionally it's been the religious parties in Israel who have put up the biggest objection to the death sentence, because there are very strict rules within halakha, within Jewish law, as to which type of a court can impose a death sentence on Jews, and therefore how do you then create a system which differentiates between Jews and non-Jews, if that's at all appropriate, and what would happen if you would have a Jewish terrorist who carries out no less a severe terrorist attack, and what would you then do with them? And so that really is a subject of much discussion. What I argued in one of my other articles that I published really closer to the start of the war is that Israel needs to change fundamentally the way that it sentences terrorists. If put aside the death sentence for a second, the way that it works at the moment is that, similar to the criminal law, a terrorist is convicted. The law sets a minimum and a maximum sentence, but within that, the judges have almost complete discretion as to what punishment to really impose on the terrorist. And really what they do is they start at the bottom and move up according to the severity of the cases. I argue that, and that the result is sentences which are, when you have a maximum sentence of 10 years, sometimes you'll see a sentence of 6 months, 7 months, a year. This is really a terrible disaster, and the system that we need to change is to adopt an approach, a policy that says we're going to start at the top. Every single terrorist convicted will be given the maximum sentence provided by the law, unless there are really tremendously extenuating circumstances. And that way, albeit the prison service will be very clogged up, but it's the only way that will ensure that the terrorists being now arrested in Judea and Samaria aren't arrested, indicted, convicted, serve their sentences, and already are released before the war is over. That is the situation that we're seeing already, and we'll see more and more as we move along. And that's something that really tremendously has to change. Just back to the death sentence for a second. On the 7th of October, there really were heinous crimes committed by hundreds of different people. So even if we were to make the changes that I believe are necessary to get to the situation where we can impose the death sentence, how many of these terrorists would the world let us actually put to death? If you have one person on death row, the world is going to be shouting. If you have 5 people on death row, they're going to be all over the place. They're going to be attacking Israel all the way. We probably have somewhere in the region of 400 to 500 people arrested on the 7th of October who are appropriate for the death sentence. Now, can you imagine what would happen even in Israel if we had lines and lines of these terrorists waiting to go up to the gallows or waiting to come before a firing squad? I think this is something which will be very, very difficult to digest, certainly for the international community, but I believe even for Israeli society.
You mentioned a distinction to deal with between Jews and Gentiles in terms of prosecution in Jewish law. I'm curious, is there a distinction between citizens and non-citizens in the way Israel can handle them and prosecute them, given that most of the terrorists we're talking about are really non-citizens of Israel?
Well, so many years ago, I was helping a member of Knesset, and that was exactly the solution that I suggested be adopted into the legislation, that a differentiation be made between Israeli citizens, Jews and Arabs alike, and people who aren't citizens, foreigners, who come in and invade Israel and carry out these terrorist attacks. And that's something, obviously, which I think should be implemented into law. And unfortunately, the discussion is predominantly taken in directions of, well, we want to get everybody possible, when I don't believe that is necessarily a realistic option. And it's better to at least implement the changes that could be made to catch as many of these terrorists who come from abroad into Israel, whether it be from Gaza or even from Judea and Samaria into Israel, and really implement the death sentence there. In Judea and Samaria, it's much less of a problem, by the way, because international law, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, specifically refer to and approve the use of the death sentence in the military courts in places like Judea and Samaria. So that really is much less of a problem, and so that's something which really should be developed along the way to find that solution.
Maurice, I really appreciate your time, and of course appreciate all the questions being submitted by our viewers, both in the chat and to my email. Final question, we have 2 minutes. It's a big issue, but I just want your quick thoughts on the matter. Of course, right now there are resumed discussions of ceasefire and negotiations happening in Cairo about a ceasefire and a deal with Hamas. What are your thoughts, 2 minutes or less, on Israel entering into a deal right now with Hamas?
So I'll say very clearly, it's very short, Moshe, actually, on the subject. Any deal that does not bring about the immediate release of all of the hostages, not some now, some in 6 weeks, some in who knows when time, all of the live hostages, all of the bodies of the hostages need to be returned immediately as part of that deal. Otherwise, there is no deal. Otherwise, Hamas, Sinwar will continue to hold however many hostages are left as leverage over Israel in order to bring about our surrender. Surrendering, stopping the war will not bring peace. It will not bring, and if it doesn't bring about the immediate return of all of the hostages on day one, then it is simply not worth entering into. I would also suggest a caution when discussing this whole subject of, or at least getting our hopes up about the discussions of a deal. Hamas is employing the most despicable psychological warfare on the Israeli population, constantly talking about this deal, which it really doesn't intend to get to, because they know that the hostages are their insurance policy for life, and they will never give up on them. They will never let them go. And therefore, all of this discussion as to a deal and what we can achieve now and what later is something which has to be taken, I would say, with a pinch of salt. And really what we need to use is massive military force in order to crush Hamas in all of its labyrinths and all of its caves and tunnels, rather than wasting time discussing fruitless deals.
Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, thank you so much for joining and for sharing all of that, including that very powerful last statement. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.